Good evening, everyone. To the ones who are joining us for the first time in this virtual event studio, welcome to College Club Online. And to the ones who joined us last month for our online lecture about Turkey, welcome back. As many of you know, since 2012, we have been organizing offline lectures in Amsterdam and sometimes in New York, with topics varying from AI to global politics, to how does your brain work and contemporary art. I'm just watching until the next slide is coming on. There you go. Now let me introduce you to the speaker of the night, Dan Hasler-Forrest. Dan teaches media studies at Utrecht University. His research is focused on the relationship between politics and popular culture, and he has published books and articles on topics like superhero movies, science fiction, comic books, Twin Peaks, and zombies. And he loves nothing more than ruining other people's enjoyment of seemingly innocent entertainment. Last summer, he incurred the wrath of Disney fans around the world by publishing an article in the Washington Post in which he accused the Lion King of fascism. Now, before I bring Dan on stage, I just want to show you and tell you a little bit of how this is going to work tonight. Tonight, we will, as you know, dive into the world of conspiracy theories and manipulation, from Hollywood films to fake news, right here in this virtual stage with augmented reality experience made possible by our partners, Faber Audiovisuals and Univate. We just learned that almost 600 people are joining this lecture, and we hope most of you are in the audience with your webcam on and microphone on. This way we can see you in the audience right in front of us. It also allows you to directly interact with the speaker by pushing the button, raise your hand. Or you are in the live stream. This means you will remain in the lobby, but you can still ask a question in the chat. Hopefully most of them will be answered during or after the lecture. Again, Dan Hasler-Forrest is your speaker for tonight, so it's going to be all very interesting and fun. Without further ado, let me introduce you to Dan. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Syra. And good evening, everybody. This is really, I can't tell you how weird it is to be on a stage like this. I can see like a bunch of you, and then there's apparently several hundred more who are just watching this, you know, eating popcorn or whatever, and like watching TV. But this, and I'm in a room that's full of green screen and virtual space around me. But I want to make like, it's what I'm used to doing is talking to an actual audience. And the nice thing about this stage is that I do actually get to do that. So if, you know, I'm hoping that many, many, many of you will turn yourselves on. Doesn't matter if you're in your, you know, pajamas or underwear or whatever, it's totally fine. Whatever we do in this space stays in here in the live stream while we go through this. Because talking to like literal nothingness, as my students will confirm, is just really freaking weird. I'm going to be talking about conspiracy theories tonight. And I'm going to try and do that without becoming a conspiracy theorist myself. But we'll see how that goes. I'll do that in two sections. I'm going to be talking about Hollywood on the one hand. And Hollywood, in a way, is a symbol for an older kind of media. Today, we live in the age of social media, of digital platforms, of platform capitalism, if you will. And when we see something on TV, we usually don't always see it at the same time. If we see a movie, we usually see it through a streaming platform like Netflix because it's been recommended to us by an algorithm. In the 20th century, when we would watch a TV program, we would usually see it at the same time. We were in the age of mass media, and Hollywood made movies for a mass audience. So the first part of the talk, the Hollywood films part, will be about looking at how post-war Hollywood developed a narrative of how conspiracy theories really give shape to our environment. The second half, we'll have some questions in between to see if people aren't too confused about all this stuff or if I've been making any kind of sense. The second half will be about our age, the 21st century, the digital age, and how media function today and how they've really helped conspiracy theories move from the margins of our society to the mainstream. Now, I'll start off with a short clip. I'll have a bunch of clips. Most of them are clips from movies that I'll just talk over. I'll just use them as visual examples that I'll talk you through. But I'll start with some footage from just last weekend in Sacramento, California, where a whole bunch of wacky Americans were protesting the lockdown. They were coming up to the middle of the city and demanding that the lockdown be ended and the state be opened back up. And one of the interesting things about watching these protesters was seeing how many conspiracy theories seemed to come together. Everything from anti-vaxxers to big world government to flat earthers to, jet fuel can't melt, steel beams, 9/11 truthers. We'll start with a little clip of looking at them, and then we'll take it from there.
Freedom! 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 Open up! You don't have a right! You cannot do this to people!
How many people own the news companies?
How many?
Well, you tell me.
Three or four.
How many does Disney own?
How many?
How many?
I don't know.
Well, maybe you ought to find out. You're in the media, aren't you?
You're an American, a born-free American! They're lying about the death tolls.
I will take a chances and get a coronavirus better than shutting down this economy.
I'll die on my feet, not on my knees.
Yeah, I want you to take the vaccine first, Bill Gates.
I want you to understand, this is China's wet dream to hurt our nation. It's their wet dream. And this is about our liberty, brother.
Who do you think's agenda this is?
Every conspiracy you pretty much ever heard of is all pretty much true. 9/11 was an inside job. No one's ever walked on the moon. The vaccines are poison. Can you cough in my face? See, people they're too scared to even cough when you ask them to.
Every conspiracy theory you've heard of is pretty much true. Media are lying to us all the time, always. Don't believe anything you see on TV. Don't believe anything you read in the newspapers. All the institutions, from politics to universities to governments, are out to get you. Now, it's easy to dismiss this kind of type as, a tinfoil-hatted weirdo. But there seem to be so many of them these days, and it's so hard to get around them. I mean, these were people you might come across back, 20 or 30 years ago in the fringes of some public library researching JFK assassinations or something like that. And now you go on social media, and there they are. You turn on YouTube, and it's everywhere. Everything seems to be some kind of conspiracy, and meanwhile, populist politicians keep telling us that what we're seeing in the media is all fake news, right? Now, it does not, and it didn't. This didn't happen out of nowhere. This didn't come out of nothing. So what I'm going to look at first is how we have a cultural history of conspiracy theories. We've been taught over many decades through developing post-war narratives to trust nothing. The idea that authority is always suspicious at the least, corrupt most likely. And I'll do that by looking at just a couple of films that each, in a way, typify a particular age. So I'll look at three major events that were hugely traumatic for our sense of identity. The first one is the explosion of the first nuclear bomb in 1945. The second one is the assassination of JFK. The third one is the Watergate scandal. And that brings us right up to 9/11, which ushers in the age of social media and the 21st century. And that'll be the second part of this talk, the age of fake news. How and why do conspiracy theories seem to flourish so beautifully, so constantly on social media? How is it that we keep being confronted with them? Why is it so easy to believe the things that we see when they're all around us all the time? So if we move from the 20th century age of Hollywood, we now live in a new kind of age, the YouTube age of people being angry on YouTube and making it really, really easy for us to find evidence that suits our ideas. So a little bit of caution, there will be conspiracy theories ahead, but the caution is not really meant to indicate that I'm going to try to give you any or even explain specific ones. The goal here tonight is not to explain why 5G is not causing the coronavirus. There are scientists who can explain that. It's not to explain why climate change is not a hoax designed by China. There are people who know there are plenty of facts that are out there, and if you want them, you can find them. I want to talk about how we all became more likely to become conspiracy theorists ourselves, and how the media organization around us has made it really easy to buy into that. So let's start where this really begins. 1945 and the beginning of the atomic age. Now, when we think of the 1940s and the 1950s, we tend to think of this as a kind of a golden age, the post-war age of the capitalist boom, the rebirth of the economy, the welfare state developing, growing means for everybody, people being able to buy their own house, have a pet, et cetera, et cetera. But that age was also the first age of rabid paranoia. And not just because of politics, not just because of the Cold War. In a lot of ways, it was because what the explosion of the first atomic bomb did was destroy our faith in traditional ideas of causal linearity. The idea that there was a kind of order to the universe that we could map out. All of a sudden, Einstein's theories of relativity made time and space things that were all relative, not absolute. Where you were depended on how fast you were going. And how fast you were going depended on where you were in space. It was all so fucking confusing. And the nuclear bomb and its explosion made our universe one of radical uncertainty. Now, when we think of movie culture and the popular culture of the 1950s, we don't usually actually think of the 1950s. We don't think about the mindset of the time or the actual artifacts of the time. We tend to be determined by the political and cultural project of constructing 1950s-ness, which was a project in the 1980s. The idea that the 1950s were a golden age for young white people, especially young white men, who got to rock out to Elvis Presley, who had easily hijacked rock and roll and made it white and made history, made America great for the first time. Right? And when we look at all the cultural artifacts, the movies and TV shows from the 1970s and 1980s, and all the kitsch and paraphernalia that accompanied it, it's very easy to think of those days as a more innocent time, a time of fun and youth culture and stuff like that. And if we look at some of the movies from that era, some of the big blockbuster movies that define Hollywood, we see things like, The Musical and Technicolor, and Ben-Hur and big biblical epics, things that tend to reaffirm the idea that, us, American white people, especially white men, were at the center of history and always had been, doing exciting things throughout history, dancing and singing and frolicking together, a time of innocence and fun and clear, absolute moral values. However, if you look at the actual history of the 1950s, and if I listened to my parents talking about what it was like to be alive at that time, it felt really scary. It felt scary because it was a time in which not conforming to political and social standards meant that you were suspicious. Everything was suspicious. McCarthyism was about trying to get to a state where everybody was willing to rat out their neighbor for being a member of the Communist Party or not, for being blacklisted, for being sent to prison, for being a member of a particular political party. It was a time that wasn't really captured by the big Hollywood epics of its age, but was captured by other genres, more, offbeat genres, things that didn't win Oscars or have a lot of prestige. Things like B-movies, thrillers like Kiss Me Deadly, or science fiction horror thrillers like Invasion of the Body Snatchers, that really got to the sense of paranoia that was all about no longer knowing what kind of world we lived in. In Kiss Me Deadly, advertised on the poster as Mickey Spillane's latest H-bomb, everybody is looking for this little device. We don't quite know what it is, but when you open it, everything will suddenly explode and go to hell. And the ending is completely terrifying and devastating. In Invasion of the Body Snatchers, people have the sense that their neighbors are no longer the people they thought they would be. And what does it even mean to live in a small town and be an American? Are we all being taken over by some kind of propaganda or not? This was the kind of paranoia that started to feed into a sense of unease, a sense of no longer really knowing who we were, what we were doing, or what was going on after the World War. Something that went against mainstream culture. And the assassination of John F. Kennedy in 1962 took this to a whole other level. Conspiracy theories started developing about was it actually Lee Harvey Oswald who had shot him? Was Lee Harvey Oswald part of some CIA cooperative? Was the government involved? Were other governments involved? Was the mafia involved? Was it so big that it was impossible to hide, or was it not quite big enough to hide well? Movies that were made about it later on, especially the movie JFK, took a lot of these conspiracies and put them together. The idea that there was no longer an invulnerability to being president, to being American, to being a white man in the United States suddenly became unsettling. And it was a mood that was captured initially by a set of films that were about this growing sense of paranoia. And the one film that I like to talk about in particular is called The Manchurian Candidate. It's a film that not many people have actually watched, but people often mention as something to do with government infiltration, paranoia, and spy thrillers. In The Manchurian Candidate, two men come back from fighting the war in Korea, and they're no longer the men they used to be. One of them is traumatized, and the other one has literally been brainwashed by the Soviets. And he's become a tool. He's become a tool working inside the United States. And the plot, which is really complicated, but I'll try to explain it very briefly. The plot is that there's supposed to be, the government is supposed to be taken over by the increasingly popular far-right populist politician, right, who isn't there to actually sell an agenda or anything like that. He's actually just there to unsettle everything with fake news, with misinformation. In this scene, I won't listen to it. It's very hectic and very noisy. It doesn't make much sense if you see it out of context. But in this scene, we see this populist politician blundering into a Senate meeting and making all kinds of accusations about people being members of the Communist Party. And I think what's striking about this scene, if you look at it visually, is the fact that the screen has been broken up into multiple realities. We see television screens and smaller television screens, each showing different perspectives on this incredibly chaotic environment. And at the same time, the political project that we're seeing going on is one of disinformation, one of somebody spreading ideas that are impossible to confirm, that seem hard to deny, that have some kind of plausibility, that there might be infiltrators who are not politically correct or anything like that, and creating chaos. It's a sense of a political system that is starting to flounder, that is no longer able to sustain the kind of legitimacy that it had always taken for granted. And of course, this floundering reached its apex in the early 1970s with Richard Nixon and the Watergate scandal. The idea that the president, who had to go on TV to say, "I am not a crook," turned out to be objectively a crook, somebody who had been part of an incredible conspiracy, of all kinds of conspiracies, and the one for which he was ultimately was forced to remove himself from the presidency, was probably the least of his crimes, was something that I think it's not exaggerating it to say dealt a kind of fatal blow to a general American faith in the political system. If the idea that the top guy could be this deeply enmeshed in all of this, not somebody who was simply going along with it, but who was at the very center of an actual conspiracy, something that wasn't even a huge thing, it was kind of a childish game of pranks on the other political party, but it doesn't even matter. It was an actual conspiracy that he was involved in, and he had to resign. And of course, one movie that captured this sense was All the President's Men, the movie that was based on the book written by the two reporters who had broken the story for the Washington Post, Woodward and Bernstein. And interestingly, of course, this is one of the films that's part of a 1970s wave of conspiracy thrillers. There are many, many of them, some of them directed by this director, Alan J. Pakula. There's Clute. There's The Parallax View. There's lots and lots of thrillers that are all about these men, they're always men, who seem lost in this world and start thinking that there's something rotten, there's something wrong with politics, and media are involved in this, and they start digging deeper and deeper, and they find out that it's worse than they thought. But at the end, at least they get to the truth. They get to find out. They go through scenes like this one, where they go to talk to a source hidden inside the government who can confirm to them that their suspicions are true. There is actually a knowable agenda going on there, and they're able to uncover it even if they're not able to fix it. So once we get to the 1970s and this whole cycle of conspiracy theory thrillers, there's stories about men feeling uncertain about where they are in contemporary America, thinking there's something wrong, and proving themselves right, even if the problem that they find is really not solved by the end. So they can't solve the problem, but at least they can understand it. By the end of the 20th century, this narrative also starts to dissolve. When we get to 9/11, right? So this is the year 2001, the very beginning of the 21st century, and all the conspiracy theories that emerge around that. We can no longer even talk about a kind of general knowability about what happened. The proliferation, sorry, that's a word I always have to explain to my students, the unchecked growth of conspiracy theories at every level about all the kinds of things that might be involved, and the speed with which they circulate is unprecedented. And the film that I think captures this more than any other at the time, is a film that was actually made 2 years before the attacks. It's David Fincher's film Fight Club, which again is about a man, a white man in America, who thinks there's something wrong, there's something rotten, there's something not right about the world. And he meets another guy, Tyler Durden, who shows him a way towards this. And of course, I hate to spoil a movie, but the movie is like more than 20 years old by now. So if you haven't seen Fight Club, I mean, that's kind of on you. They find that what is actually true is no longer even knowable. They find that where previous generations might have discovered a conspiracy, unearthed it, right, and been able to solve it, he only finds schizophrenia. He finds what we find when we look up terms like 9/11 truther, or who did 9/11, or 9/11 inside job. Just one level of ideas upon more speculation and more and more and more. And it's interesting now, it's almost a little bit uncanny. It's unsettling to watch the ending of Fight Club, where we watch this movie about a man who can't connect to others, especially not to women, who feels lost in postmodern America, who doesn't know who he is really, who has to get in touch with his inner id, Tyler Durden, his inner masculinity, and go out and fight with other men to ultimately find that the only thing that will solve his existential dilemma and will give him answers is total destruction, right? He has to destroy himself and the environment around him in order to rediscover his cock that we just saw flashing by in that little insertion, right? The idea that he can only be together and connect with other people through destroying things around him and by displaying this rottenness, by rebooting, by in a way sort of ending history for a moment, is, I think, incredibly telling for how the 20th century ended and the age we entered. So this, I think, maps out a little bit of an entry point into thinking about conspiracy theories and how they have developed throughout Hollywood narratives from the late 1940s up until the late 20th century. I'm going to take a little break in case there's questions. Some people might be thinking, what the hell have you been talking about? Maybe you have a very specific question about a specific film or a specific era. We have, the audience is going to be right up here on my screen, and we're going to have, if somebody, you can either raise your actual hand or you can push the raise hand button. I can't actually see you. Hello, hello. You can raise your hand if you have a question. Thank you for waving. That's really nice. You can ask a question, and I will try to answer it anyway. Right over here on the big screen. That isn't actually there, but I mean, we can all see it. Anybody with a question coming in? Not yet? I can just stand here like an avatar, and just sort of move, sway back and forth gently like a computer game avatar. People are like, no, just keep talking or shut up. Both fine. Yeah, we have a question? Somebody coming on the screen? It's so exciting. I mean, this is so weird. I've never. Oh, there's a question. Okay. Hi.
Hi. I was wondering, I've heard you talk about superhero. No, you wrote about superhero movies, and I wonder how this plays into, the whole thing that you just described with Fight Club and conspiracy theories. How does the superhero movies like Captain America play into that idea that we can no longer trust government?
Well, thank you. That is for me. That is a great question because I literally wrote a book about this, so I'm like super happy to try and answer it. So I wrote a book like ages ago that was originally my PhD. The book is called Capitalist Superheroes. You probably don't want to buy it, but you could if you wanted to, theoretically. One of the points that I try to argue in the book is that the resurgence of superhero movies after 9/11, right? One of the things that really that we see in a lot of these, especially the first wave of superhero movies, is origin stories, right? So I think if we see 9/11 as this kind of historical rupture, right? There's something that wasn't necessarily a complete break in history, but that in the media was certainly constructed as such, right? So we all talked about pre-9/11 thinking versus post-9/11 thinking. So we're now in a new age, had to define enemies in a different way, had to think about warfare and history in a different way, right? So like Captain America, the First Avenger, or Batman Begins, or Superman Returns, right? All of these movies that appeared all of a sudden from 2002 up to about 2008. This proliferation again of origin stories was about reestablishing a sense of American white masculinity in the face of historical trauma. So if you can say that Fight Club is like the dark side of this kind of, of understanding and coming to realize that for white men in America, right, your power is receding and there's nothing we can really do about it. There's been all kinds of movements that have made our central status, questionable and more difficult to maintain. And a lot of what these movies did was try to restore some of that, right? Try to provide new identities in figures like Iron Man and in figures like Batman that added new elements to existing mythologies, right? So I would say that after 9/11, we get, and now we're in a whole other phase of superhero mythology, but overall, right, what those superhero movies have been doing is revisiting these sites of trauma, especially 9/11, which we seem to be going back to over and over and over again, and transforming it from something that was a terrible cataclysm, something that completely, wiped out a sense of continuity, to something that could actually be resolved and transformed into a moment of heroism. Of course, you can't do it because of the clash with history that you keep getting, so that's why they have to keep revisiting this scene of original crime, I guess. I hope that answers it at least a little bit. Were there any other questions? Anyone here? Or maybe in the chat? Questions on the chat? Okay. Okay, so I'm going to read out the question. Here in Germany, mainstream pop star Xavier Naidoo, is that a Star Wars character? I don't know. Xavier Naidoo started openly spreading conspiracy theories. Is the threat bigger, the more famous the spreader? Oh, wow. I'm going to get to that and the logic of social media in a moment. But I mean, yes, obviously. I mean, I don't think it's necessarily the fact that famous people spreading conspiracy theories is more dangerous or even that new. I think the fact that the media channels, and I'll talk about this in a moment, but I'll get a head start, that media, which had always been strongly filtered before they reached us. So information had to pass through a whole bunch of filters before it was published or before it was broadcast. And there's a lot that, that has been criticized, I think, justifiably about that process, about the idea that there were all these gatekeepers who ran newspapers, TV stations, movie studios, publishing companies, et cetera, who all decided what information was worth publishing, right? In our age, those filters are no longer in place. People put something on YouTube or Facebook or anywhere, and it can reach many, I don't know if anybody else, I mean, I'm not an influencer or anybody who's like famous on social media, but now and then you do a thing and it suddenly goes viral, and all of a sudden you're the center of attention for like, a couple of hours or a day maybe. It's really unsettling. Well, that can only happen in an age where those traditional filters no longer really operate. So I think what we're seeing in, political figures spreading conspiracy theories and celebrities and other influencers spreading information either because they just didn't think about it and they just pressed retweet or send or something like that, or they have some kind of agenda, who knows? I mean, those are things that can only happen in a media infrastructure where you can reach so many people without it having passed through a particular kind of process. Yep, so were there other questions on, there's a question on Zoom over here. Jamie, hi.
Oh, hi.
Hi.
Yeah, I was wondering, you think with like subcultures, for example, let's just say Star Wars fans, where conspiracy theories might spread, do you think that's to do with just like the specific content that these subculture fans are a fan of, or just the nature of it being like small communities on social media or whatever website?
Wow, that's another big question, but a really good one. I would say that where we used to have a distinction between mainstream culture and subcultures, right? Like some people would be really into Star Trek, but that was like a thing for a group. And that group would get together, but they wouldn't really impact mainstream culture so much. So whatever they were saying wouldn't really branch out so much. Now, there no longer really is a kind of central mainstream culture. Now, we get to an environment where we have a gigantic transnational network of different niche cultures converging in unpredictable ways. So just this afternoon, I was reading about there was a thread on Twitter by an investigative journalist who was writing about, he wondered why all those, why so many of these heavily armed American survivalist protesters were wearing Hawaiian shirts, right? So he started investigating, and he found out that, so what happened was there were Reddit communities, right, where people were talking about the second Civil War coming, yeah, and somehow in meme culture, the second Civil War started being called Civil War II Electric Boogaloo, because a lot of people there were fans of the 1980s, you know, camp flop Breakin' 2 Electric Boogaloo, which was a film that is so notoriously bad that it attracted its own subculture. And so Civil War II Electric Boogaloo became Boogaloo, which became Big Luau, which became memed into these Hawaiian shirts, which is why now so many of these armed survivalist protesters who seriously want a second Civil War and are coming to Washington with their, you know, hand grenade launchers and shit like that are wearing Hawaiian shirts. So I think it's one of these, you know, one of these crazy examples of how, you know, of a kind of how meanings are being connected in ways that were never possible before, because people from all these different intersecting subcultures are able to find each other on places like Reddit and 4chan and InfinityChan and other, you know, niche-oriented digital environments. And because, you know, some of them are just having fun, and a lot of this is very humorous and, you know, ironic and for the lulz, and some of them have a very clear, hard-right political agenda. And those things sort of contaminate each other and grow into a very specific kind of conspiracy theory culture, which we're seeing, you know, so much more of now. But I'll return to this in a little bit. Thanks for that. That's a great question. We have one more question before we'll move on. There's Madelon. Hi.
Hi.
Or is it your naked man behind you? Hi.
Yeah, we were taking your hint to turn on the Zoom whilst being in our underwear.
Excellent. Good choice.
No, but I had a question about what your thoughts on why the conspiracy theories stay a theory. So you mentioned about Fight Club, which is essentially a story about someone creating a revolutionary movement. And your example just a couple of minutes ago was these armed guys in the Hawaiian shirts. It feels like many of the things which are so-called conspiracy theories, lesser wars have been started in Africa in the 80s and the 90s, civil wars, etc. There's been lesser accusations that have toppled governments. And I was wondering what your thoughts were on why they're staying theories and not kind of moving into something more like a popular movement or a political party or something like this.
Ah, wow. That's a tough one. I mean, like, honestly, I don't know why that hasn't happened. I'm glad it hasn't happened in that particular way yet. I think we're seeing something in the middle of that happening, right? We're not quite seeing a big political movement that is drawing all of these, you know, wackadoodle conspiracy theories together into one big tent, you know? So there are a lot of little tents that are sort of connected to each other in sometimes quite precarious ways, and sometimes very strange and, you know, unpredictable ways as well. But we are seeing people who are sort of on the edges of the political establishment. You know, people like Nigel Farage in the UK, certainly Donald Trump and other, you know, Tea Party Tea Party inspired politicians in the United States. Which country was that? In the United States. All over Western Europe, the far right parties are incorporating a lot of that energy into their messaging, right? Into their communications platform. Not necessarily directly into their political programs to the extent that they even exist, but into feeding the sense that they are on their side, right? So there's a lot of retweeting and sort of subliminal messaging going back and forth between politicians at that far right end of the spectrum and these much more fringe movements that have clearly felt strengthened and emboldened by the fact that they are not being criticized, certainly not heavily, and that in many ways they're being encouraged by their language becoming part of a kind of generalized speech, right? And I think the thing that has really strengthened that process has been the fact that traditional news media are so precarious right now, right? Their budgets have been cut. They have to compete with each other in commercial marketplaces. They're dependent upon commercial and privately owned social media platforms. So they're all competing for attention and for money. And the thing that gets attention and money, and again, this is something I'm going to come to in a moment, is stuff that makes you upset, stuff that makes you angry. And the things that make you upset and angry are things that are about, whatever your problems are, they're not actually your fault, and often they aren't, but they're also not that complicated. There is some kind of simple explanation that pulls all of this together, right? And that's where I think you see the intersection of a particular kind of still sort of fringe-like conspiracy theorizing and ethno-nationalist and other far-right political movements that are becoming more, simpatico towards each other. So I think that's where, and I think that's a coalition that has been building, but that hasn't reached sort of a point of mass. And it's a very unpredictable and volatile thing, right? Because you're seeing a lot of those sort of fringe movements becoming impatient with people like Donald Trump or, other far-right politicians, that once they become part of an establishment, they're not actually moving fast enough or being crazy enough for them, So I think that's where we are right now. Okay, I'm going to go and move on to the second section because these are all great questions and clearly we could talk about this literally forever. But I have a whole other bunch of slides to get through before we do that. So we're going into the age of social media, right? I'm going to start out by saying something really crazy, which is that when we think about fake news and conspiracy theories and the kind of batshit media environment that we're in right now, we really have the iPod to blame. And I know that sounds crazy, but it's kind of true. The thing is, and this is stuff that you come across when you're a media studies guy, I guess, when you read media scholarship. In the early years of the 21st century, we all know, right? The whole music industry was basically demolished by the introduction of digital music and digital music platforms. So what happened, right? If you imagine, if you think about the economy of music and radio, and you think about privately owned radio stations, how do they make their money? By playing music for people driving around in their cars and listening on their radios and stuff like that. All of a sudden, these people aren't so interested in listening to music on the radio anymore because they can listen to whatever music they like on their portable devices that they can download and they can shuffle and they can organize whatever. You can carry, 2,000 songs in your back pocket or something like that. So what do radio stations do, especially local radio stations? They have advertisers and they need income. They don't want to go bankrupt, and people are switching off the radios because now they're listening to their iPods. They start programming talk radio, right? Talk radio is something that is cheap to produce. Yeah? You just got to hire some guy to sit behind a microphone and talk. You get people upset and angry to call in. It's hugely entertaining. And all of a sudden, there's a whole new business model for local radio stations. And this is the birth of what we might call outrage media, right? If media had always been about reassurance, right? Media, certainly in the United States, but more generally worldwide, had been commercial. So they had to make money in order to stay afloat, which means they don't want to upset people too much because if you get upset, you call in, you get angry at your station, you don't want to ruffle any feathers. This is the dominant idea of mainstream media. Keep everything safe and solid, no violence, no child pornography, no weird stuff at all, ever. No swearing, no sex, you get it. Talk radio will get you talking. Well, what gets you talking? Outrageous stuff. Crazy, outlandish theory, raging lunatics talking about how Rush Limbaugh is what you get, right, when you get talk radio, getting people super upset. And then when you think about politics, you think, wait, it's actually not that easy to get people upset by spewing left-wing politics, by saying the world should be more fair, the rich people should invest more money in, we should have complex social democracy systems. No, it's much easier to get people upset by saying the man is out to get you, the government is out to get you, they all have it in for us, the immigrants are coming and they're going to take your jobs. Women are getting too uppity and they want work just like you. They want the same pay and they want to get your jobs too. Every kind of lunatic idea, that was the kind of thing that would make money. And so when you look at the media landscape today, look at things like Fox News and popular YouTubers and far-right, intellectuals like Ben Shapiro or InfoWars, these are all platforms that grew out of talk radio's resurgence. Talk radio as a platform that made outrage the thing that got people going and that got advertisers paying. And so if you look at how media consumption has changed over the past century, right, we can see in a graph like this that the amount of media that we consume on average has constantly grown, and grown quite explosively from the early 2000s onwards. But we also see that the amount of media that we consume that is traditional broadcast media has diminished over the past years, and that the amount of digital media that we see, especially on our phones, on digital social media platforms, continues to grow, especially amongst younger users. And so we've seen a transformation of what used to be mass media. And I often use this image with my students because I find it so, like, it really shows two things, like the benefit and the dark side of having mass media, right? Mass media are things that bring people together, right? You got the evening news that says, good evening, goedenavond Nederlanders, you know, good evening people that are all part of this large community. It creates this sense of homogeneous identity, which also means that if you don't recognize yourself in that identity, I mean, hey, tough luck, you know, too bad. Oh, you're a woman, oh, you're gay, oh, well, you know, you're not part of our normative environment. You may not feel so welcome, right? But it also, so that's the dark side of it. But the benefit of it is that you have a stronger sense of a shared reality, right? The media define what the reality is to a large extent in an environment that is too complex to sort of take in on your own. Now that we've seen this, again, I keep using this word proliferation, but this bombardment of all these different platforms and companies and channels that are no longer really organized like mass media. Right? They are mass media in the sense that, I mean, Facebook is a mass medium. It reaches billions of people. But no two people see the same feed in Facebook, right? If you're sitting next to somebody on the couch and you both have your tablet or your thing out, you're like, what's on your Facebook? Oh, it's like this, that's like all cooking stuff. Oh, I've got like mass murder going on over here. It can be anything depending on your preferences and your profile. And then we run into this problem, right? We run into a problem that's a psychological problem. It's called cognitive bias. Right? And I'm not a psychologist, so I won't get into a lot of details, but it just helps to understand, first of all, that we are not as rational as we like to think we are, right? We tend to think we're rational, enlightened beings who choose things with our mind and reason our way through the world, but there's actually quite a substantial gap. I mean, oh, there's one in me, right, in between how I think and how I actually think, yeah? We are much less rational than we think we are. We've been taught, you know, by Enlightenment theory that I think, therefore I am, right? Cogito ergo sum. I think. That makes me a person. And whenever I do something, I do it consciously. I bought a $200 headphone set the other day. I mean, it wasn't a conscious, rational decision. I don't know. I didn't even know why I bought it, and I already almost forgot about it. It was just like an impulse buy, a thing. Nothing rational about any of it. It was pure emotion. Yeah? So if we take that idea that we're not that reasonable, we're not that rational to begin with, our minds don't work that way, we find another kind, a very specific kind of bias called confirmation bias. Yeah? It means that what we tend to believe, is the thing that we look for when we see facts. So we don't spend our day going out and looking for the facts. Just tell me the facts, Jack. No, we don't do that. We come across stuff, and when it fits our idea of how the world is, we tend to believe it. If it doesn't, we tend to either ignore it or reject it. Now, when I talk about, you know, reading newspapers or watching the news, and, you know, when those things existed, and I tell my students about back when we read newspapers and watched television news, I say, like, it was like when your parents tell you to eat your vegetables. You know, I mean, it's not necessarily delicious or exciting, but, you know, it's important that you do it every day, or you're going to get sick. If you then have a dessert afterwards, you know, you watch some crappy game show on TV, that's totally fine, but you got to watch the news, you got to be informed, you got to read the newspaper. And none of those things is ideal, but there you have it. Now that we're no longer in an environment where those things are part of our daily media landscape, right? We're in an environment where every kind of information flow is accessible to us at all times. It's much easier to go out and find evidence to support a theory that we already have. And we don't even have to actively do it. The problem that makes this much worse is the fact that the way Facebook and other corporate social media platforms make money is by buying our attention, by using algorithms that constantly tempt us to come back for more. And what do we come back for more for? What do we want more of? Those things that make us feel something. Either feel nice, like, you know, cat gifs and things like that, or make us feel upset. Things that make us, you know, oh my God, they're going to build. Seriously? Immigrants are going on vacation to their home country and I can't even go on vacation because I'm not even getting paid that much? That's ridiculous. It doesn't matter if it's true or not. If you see it and it confirms your sense of how the world works, you're much more likely to believe it. And since, as I was saying in the Q&A, so we've covered that, since that it hasn't passed through any filters, it can just be out there, it's much easier, there's much more of it, and it travels really fast. So then we get that famous symptom of what we call the filter bubble emerging, right? This idea that we're being isolated more and more by being on all of these platforms that are literally designed to give us more of what we want, right? You watch 3 different shows on Netflix, you're going to be offered more shows that are like that. And they have genres on there that I didn't even know existed. They have a genre called Swedish dramas featuring strong female protagonists, right? Because apparently I watched a couple of those and now they're recommending that as a whole variety package of things. If I hadn't watched any of them, I probably wouldn't know of the existence of that genre. Now, I mean, watching Swedish crime dramas with strong female protagonists, I mean, I don't think that's going to be harmful to anything or anybody. But if you keep clicking, if you start out being curious about vaccination because you've heard there's some discussion about it, and you click on a couple of links, and all of a sudden every day Facebook is sending you more stuff that they think you will like, now all of a sudden, before you know it, you're part of 3 different Facebook groups full of people who are telling you every day in all of these discussions, no, it's true. Seriously, I've got the facts. Have you seen this? Have you seen that YouTube video? Have you watched that guy talk for 3 hours about it? Have you heard about Jordan Peterson, right? So we get into an environment where it just simply becomes much, much easier to become overwhelmed by information. And since relatively few of us are trained investigative journalists or researchers, we don't usually have the skills or the time or the desire to really go out and find out what the truth is, what the facts are, especially if the internet gives you access to so many different points of view and so many different facts that, who gets to decide, right? So I guess, and I like to quote Frederick Jameson here as one of my favorite cultural theorists. He basically had all of this figured out in the 80s. He said, the problem has become that the world has become so complex that we're no longer able to create what he calls a cognitive mapping of our world, right? And with cognitive mapping, he means, we all need some kind of sense of place and understanding of how the world works at a very basic level, right? So you might be able to draw a little chart of how you get to the train station in the morning to get to work. It wouldn't be very detailed. It would be a rough kind of thing like this picture over here, right? But that's a cognitive map of how your world is kind of organized, how you take your kids to school, where your favorite store, things like that. So that we're good at doing that at a quite basic level. But when you start thinking about how the world is actually organized, right? And you see, this is a GIF that just shows 24 hours of airline traffic, pre-coronavirus, right? You're just like, holy shit, that's incredible how many airplanes are up in the sky at any given moment. And it's just a little visual illustration that reminds you how infinitely complex the systems are that we have in the world, that we are no longer able to map them. Our brains are just not designed to understand a reality that's this complex. Right? Economists don't understand the economy. They have AI running all these microtransactions and acting faster than human bodies can even act. It's become too complicated to understand. And so Jameson says that conspiracy theory, and he wrote this, I think, in 1986. He said, conspiracy theory we should understand as what he calls a degraded attempt to think the impossible totality of the contemporary world system, right? So, we want to understand what's going on. Like all those guys in conspiracy thrillers were like, but what's the real reality here? What is the actual truth of this situation? And you start looking at it, and the more you look at it, the more crazy and complicated it becomes, right? And you start thinking, oh my God, I've been taught that my mind is amazing, that my mind can do anything, that I'm super smart, and I should be able to understand this, but I can't. Right? So you fall back on what he calls, your degraded attempt to now understand it, is say, but now I know. The secret key, one thing, right? One network of information will give me access to actually understand what's going on. And all of this was basically pointed out in 1999 by another film, came out the same year, called The Matrix. Right? In The Matrix, it's the same thing that we see over and over again. A white guy is, he doesn't know what's going on. He has this problem, there's something weird in the world, but I don't know what it is. And he meets some really radical, cool people who are like, no, there totally is a secret. There's a secret, and it's called The Matrix. He says, that sounds cool. Can you tell me what The Matrix is? I said, no, I can't tell you, right? You have to be shown what The Matrix is. So I'm going to show the scene where Neo, who's played, like everybody I'm sure knows The Matrix. So Neo, but it's fun to watch this scene. Neo, who's the white guy who doesn't know what's going on, he meets Morpheus, the cool guy with the glasses, who's going to explain that the world, that he's right, and that the idea that there was a conspiracy is totally true, and he's going to show him how to figure it out. Here we go. All I'm offering you is the truth and nothing more. And once you take the red pill, there's no going back. Now, it's so fascinating to watch this at so many levels in the year 2020. In a lot of ways, you could say, to me anyway, The Matrix is like the Rosetta Stone of 21st century culture and politics. Everything that is around us is in there in one way or the other. Here you have a film, right, written and directed by two trans women that is about somebody who feels like his body isn't really his true identity, and he needs to find a community that will accept who he actually is so he can fully transform and show how glorious and powerful he actually is, right? It's a trans allegory in so many ways. That's one way of reading it, right? It's not the only way of reading it clearly, right? There are radically different ways in which this film has by now been appropriated, most famously by MRA movements who have adopted the phrase red pilling, right, for suddenly seeing the real truth of our world, which is that men have been enslaved by feminists and ethnic minorities and corrupt, soft, liberal politicians and have lost touch with their true masculinity, and that they need to rediscover it. How these online communities have taken this idea that once you revert to true masculinity, once you revert to that, and this is something that has radicalized so many people over the years and has been, the basis for so many different, endless Pepe the Frog memes and all kinds of Reddit culture, not to mention Milo Yiannopoulos and other stuff. And Elon Musk just last week, I don't know if anybody followed that on Twitter, Elon Musk tweeted out all of a sudden, for reasons unknown, take the red pill. Ivanka Trump immediately jumped in and was like, okay, that's like the Republicans, right? That's the red pill. We're the red party, red states. Taken. I'm on board. Strong men, Republicans. And then Lily Wachowski, the writer-director of The Matrix, jumped in and, of course, responded to both of them with the epic, just fuck both of you, okay? You are totally misreading the movie that we made about our experience and transforming it into something that is the opposite of the radical left-wing media criticism and societal criticism that it was meant to be. But this sort of flexibility to meaning, again, is typical not only of the world of The Matrix, but of the world of 21st century media culture. And many feminists identified this early on in around 2012 and 2013 in the Gamergate movement, right? The online movement of white male members of the gamer culture who decided that women wanting to be part of the games industry and wanting some degree of representation within gaming, because guess what? Women like to game, was really not called for, and they had to protect their culture by harassing, bullying, and threatening any number of women online. The Gamergate development, the Gamergate movement, was an early telltale sign of what was to come in terms of conspiracy theorizing. And if you've heard the phrase, it's actually about ethics in games journalism, I think you have, again, one central part of what it means to be a conspiracy theorist in the 21st century. And of course, the idea that conspiracy theory was not just something that was for the fringes, but that was actually a central part of our politics became even clearer when a president was elected, or sort of elected anyway, whose entire political career was built on the birther conspiracy theory that somehow Barack Obama wasn't actually an American citizen, that he therefore was not eligible for the presidency, and the only reason he ever became acknowledged in politics at all was the endless racist reproduction of that same conspiracy idea. And he followed this up, of course, with endless numbers of other conspiracy theories that in so many ways have normalized the spreading of what once would have been considered irrational, crazy ideas. The idea that climate change is not something proven by science, but a hoax developed by China to weaken the American economy. if that's something that is being spread, even if it's contradicted later on or withdrawn or just simply ignored, it means that those kinds of ideas now circulate as part of what we still might consider some form of mainstream culture. And what I mean by that is not so much that mainstream culture still exists, but that the relics of mainstream culture, i.e. TV stations, TV pundits, newspapers, that they reproduce that because people in big political roles, the President of the United States, are saying it. So then you get talk shows that are devoted to debating that question. Is it really true? Well, of course it's not true. Well, but somebody said it, so should we now debate it, right? And it's something where we get this strange inverted reality where right-wing cartoonists like Ben Garrison, like you see here, constantly draw pictures of how what is considered the liberal media, the Silicon Valley people, Barack Obama, Zuckerberg, all those guys are all trying to burn the actual spreaders of conspiracy theories at the stake, that they're in some way mobilizing laws and regulations against free speech, that things that are patently and obviously ridiculous. I mean, in a sort of entertaining way, like the Flat Earth movement. The growing number of people, and I've honestly seen stickers around my Utrecht environment here in the Netherlands saying, you know, look it up, it's true, look up the facts and you'll find out that you've been lied to your entire life. The flat earth is real. The globe is a fiction meant to keep us, I don't know, stupid, lied to, something or other. And if you watch any number of these documentaries that are being made about flat earthers, because of course we find it amusing and fascinating, we find something, I think the most interesting thing that we discover is what draws people into these things. It's not the sense that they think they're rationally being convinced of an argument. It's generally people who feel isolated and alienated from their general environment and who find a community that welcomes them. And just like Morpheus tells Neo, you know, it makes it really super exciting to be part of the resistance. Just join us, take the red pill, and we will be there for you. That social engagement is an incredibly strong element. And I think that is where the real threat and the real danger is of the development of these online conspiracy theories and the radicalization, especially of young white men who feel threatened, isolated, anxious, and see no clear future for themselves in the way that they had been taught by Hollywood and by video games that they would always be the most important figures in the universe, that they would be Luke Skywalker, right? That they would be Mario and would get the princess at the end of the game. Their lives are not working out like that for any number of complicated reasons, right? And finding a community that together believes, or at least spreads information that brings them together helps, right? It makes you feel, it gives you a home. It makes you feel safe. Of course, one thing that also unites many of these conspiracy theorists is hatred, right? Is fear of other groups, is anti-Semitism, like the endless conspiracy theories surrounding George Soros and the lies about him having been a Nazi in the Second World War and a photograph of somebody else showing that he was clearly a Nazi. All these kinds of things that are so easily fact-checked and disproven, but that circulate like wildfire. Or the Great Replacement theory, the idea that as a white man we are under threat, and what is going to happen, we are going to be bred out of this world by dark people, and we need to mobilize ourselves against it. We need to close our borders. We need to protect ourselves from all of these dangerous black people who are even taking over Star Wars and using code terms like white genocide. I mean, the only kind of genocide that never actually happened in history, as a code word for this racist conspiracy theory about how Hollywood is removing white people, and especially white men, from central positions and giving them to other characters. How diversity, as this tweet points out, diversity has become a code word for white genocide. And that's where I think we see a lot of connecting lines in these various conspiracy theories that show that they really aren't just innocent, you know, ways to waste people's time with nothing better to do. I think in that sense, and maybe we'll turn to that in the Q&A, but the question about, you know, why hasn't this yet become some kind of grand political movement and that wars have been started for less? It's totally true. And it is in a way terrifying to see these armed to the teeth militias come into the capitals of different American states over the past weeks and demand that the state be reopened, and see politicians who are understandably afraid, you know, stopping the political process under this kind of pressure and not knowing how to deal with them and not knowing what to do in this kind of situation. But it's a situation in which all of these ironies tend to topple over on top of each other. And I just want to end with this sign, that was at one of the recent protests over the weekend. Truth is learned, not told. Do your own research, it says. So I think, as somebody who has for many years been a critical media scholar, and one of the things that I've enjoyed doing is to help students understand that media are not necessarily innocent, and that they do give us all kinds of messages that aren't necessarily good, that might, that we could be critical of, that The Lion King is a fascist movie, stuff like that, that there's all kinds of ideology and politics wrapped into entertainment that we might be aware of. But that doing research really does mean doing a kind of research and having the skills to do research. And that's, not everybody has the skills to do research. A lot of people think that they have the facts right at their fingertips, but as all my students know, it's hard to learn to do research. You have to be methodical, and you have to have access to a lot of resources that aren't just simply there on Reddit all the time, right? And it's really hard to resist the sense that we have become Woodward and Bernsteins because it's so easy to find so much information, and so much of the information presents itself to us as facts, even though it might not always be factual. Anyway, that's my talk for this evening. Wow, just about an hour, so I almost made it. Just to sum up the three main points that I think that I'd prepared anyway. I don't know if that's where I exactly wound up, but they're good takeaways. First of all, I think the development of Hollywood conspiracy theories have taught us this kind of increasing frustration with unknowability. I think the idea that the universe is knowable is something that we just, we're still teaching people and growing up with, and the idea that there's this radical uncertainty about everything, it just still fucks us right up. And we've seen a development throughout Hollywood conspiracy theories that sees it getting incrementally worse and more difficult to deal with. We've also seen that social media algorithms really facilitate and strengthen confirmation bias. So when you're constantly being bombarded with information and data that wants your time, and that is monetizing your profile, and that wants nothing but you to just stay on that platform for as long as possible, they will always feed you stuff that the computers think you want because it looks like the other things that you've looked at. And that makes it really easy. I'm a fucking media scholar, and I've caught myself retweeting stuff that I was like, wait, that's almost too good to be true, right? That can't be actually true, and it turns out it wasn't. But it just felt like, it should be true. In my world, it should be true. And I'm supposed to be trained to recognize this stuff, right? So I stopped doing that. So conspiracy theory, finally, also feeds a cultural narrative of aggrieved white masculinity. And if you look at a lot of these conspiracy theorists, that's what they are. They are angry white men who feel like the world is no longer organized around them, not for them. That there are all kinds of challenges that other groups have had for centuries, that black people have had to deal with in much worse ways for much longer, that women have had, that LGBT people have had, and have had to fight for rights to get them. And white men, I never had to bother about any of that stuff, about difficulties getting a job. It was just the world was their oyster, and now it is no longer their oyster. And so finding a conspiracy theory to explain why the world is no longer there entirely for you seems like, it's a little bit too easy to take that red pill and start believing the lie that is too good to be true. All right, okay. Hopefully we have a couple of questions. We don't really have literal time left, but time no longer exists post-coronavirus, so who cares? So we'll go on to see if there's any questions on Zoom, in which case you will be up here on the big screen. Does anybody want to come up on the big screen after having listened to me for an hour? Any hands going up? I'm looking in the audience on the green floor. Slide? Oh, there's a chat one over here. Okay, so if movies influence us, and if unchecked growth of belief in conspiracies is bad for society as a whole, should we discourage these types of movies being made? Ooh, no, I don't. Well, okay, so I don't think any type of movie should really be discouraged from being made, right? You wouldn't believe the number of people who think that I wanted to censor The Lion King or something after writing an article that was critical about it. And my kids watch The Lion King. I watch The Lion King. It's fine. Well, we don't need fewer movies or different kinds of movies. We need more media literacy. So we need the tools, and this is something that it's still crazy to me that high schools, or even elementary schools, in our time, where like, I have a daughter who's 8, and she's already asking, when do I get a phone? Because she has friends who have a phone, and the phone just gives them access to this whole other world. But they're not taught any media literacy classes. They don't know what Facebook is or how it works. They learn how to use it before they understand what it actually is. And they develop, I was talking to a friend of mine who has an older kid, and he said, you know, it's so crazy. I actually have to go through her phone every night. And I'm like, dude, you can't do that. That's invasion of privacy. And he's like, no, I know, it's terrible. But the reason I have to do it is all these kids are on Instagram, and they have like multiple accounts, and they use them to tease and bully each other. And before you know it, they're either the victim or the perpetrator of some of these things because they're just constantly trying out all this stuff, and they don't know what they're doing, right? They're just finding their way. They're fucking teenagers, right? So I have to do it because they're not being taught how to use this. So, like, I don't think movies are teaching us anything really bad. It's a media environment that allows us to go into all of these areas and connect things, and then the way we read those movies is a reflection of that, right? So whether you see The Matrix as an allegory for transgender people, like the way I do, and also a cool science fiction movie, right? Or as an allegory about masculinity and red pilling in the way that MRA people have entitled it, right? That's not up to the movie. That's up to your social environment and the truths that you have absorbed. And if you've been taught media literacy in a meaningful way, then you're able to decode that stuff better, right? You're better. Okay, so I'll move on to the next question. Don't you think we create in our minds a filter that protects us? In other words, every new thing is a threat, and history has proven that we survive. You know, I don't think we've been in this kind of crisis before. I mean, I don't think we don't have any, the thing is we don't have any precedents for the different kinds of crisis that we are in. So we don't have a precedent for climate change, for climate disaster right now. We don't have any kind of historical precedent for that kind of thing. We also don't have any historical precedent for what happens when, you know, eats pussy 84 dot whatever, right, can suddenly be retweeted by the president of the United States and have his far-right anti-Semitic messaging go out to like 80 million people, and then have CNN pick it up and broadcast it to another 300 million people. I mean, those kinds of things have never happened before. And I don't think that that our minds, I wish we would all reach a point where our minds sort of develop a magical protective filter that allows us to understand how this works and distinguish between them. But there again, I think that we might overestimate our cognitive skills, our ratio, our reason. We're not reasonable beings. I mean, we can be reasonable under circumstances, right? Under the right circumstances, I can be perfectly reasonable. But when I'm really upset about something, I'm not inclined to be reasonable, right? Ask my kids. I won't be reasonable if I'm upset about something. And if you're going through, you know, what seems to be like the dying throes of capitalism, sorry, I had to go there for just that one brief moment. If we're going through this global catastrophe, not many people are inclined to be very reasonable. We tend to get very upset. And outrage feeds into that and makes us even less inclined to be reasonable. So no, I'm afraid I'm not going to be like the optimist right now and say, well, you know, at some point this will just resolve itself either magically or just biologically by shielding us from this thing, and we will get immune to it. Like on good days, I look at kids, you know, protesting climate change and school strikes and things like that. I'm like, thank God the next generation is going to save us. But then the next day I go look on Reddit and I go on these sub-threads and it's all 14-year-old, you know, racist white boys making each other more racist. And I'm like, God damn it, you know, that's also that generation. So, you know, what are you going to do? I hope the good guys win. A friend of mine once joked that, you know, it's a good thing that America is protected by a magical spell that makes everything turn out okay in the end, you know, which he was being sarcastic. But I wish it were true. It's not. Okay. Are we out of time? I think we are out of time.
We are, and well, maybe let's thank you by applauding virtually. We can't see you.
Well, I will applaud the audience because it was so,
yes.
like, it was really kind of cool to have all these people in their homes.
Like,
you know, shirtless audience is kind of awesome.
It's a good place to spread, I think, conspiracy theories. So if maybe we should make up one that would influence that. No. Well, it would be a good space at least.
Yes,
to do it.
It would be.
Thank you so much for this lecture. Thank you very much for participating in this lecture. And my very generic question would be, so where does this leave us right now?
Right now, I know, I like the only realistic answer is we're just royally screwed right now.
Right, okay.
I won't qualify that. I mean, hopefully that will, like, that kind of outrage and anger will be like people, no, I'm going to prove to you that we're not. I'm going to fix this shit. So maybe that will be the inspiration that we need.
We definitely do. And it's good to keep communicating and you giving lectures. So hopefully, maybe you should just do this 24/7 and spread
I'll just
your
stay
knowledge.
in the virtual
You
studio,
stay here.
and I'll be the next talk radio thing talking anti.
I would applaud
it's
that.
Too complicated. Okay.
Yeah. So thank you very much, Dan, for this intriguing lecture. And to all of you, thank you so much for participating. Hopefully most of your questions were answered through Zoom or via the chat. And for now, well, we hope you will join us again, either next month or the month after in our next lectures. And from us, I think we should just wave very scarily goodbye, like in very scary
awkward
movies.
waving. I always do the Forrest Gump wave at the end of every Zoom meeting. I can't not wave. Like my students always laugh. They're like, dude, you're waving again. I know, I can't not. So I wave, Zoom
On
wave.
behalf of us, good evening.
There, Zoom, yes.
Oh, is it?
Well, we're doing the distance, so, okay.
See you. Well done. You did really well.